February 11th, 1945, Yorkshire. England, 7:30 a.m. The morning frost clung to the wire fencing like crystalline tears, and through the mist, the sound of boots on frozen earth echoed across the compound. POW Klaus Richter pressed his face against the cold glass of Hut 14. Watching British guards distribute breakfast rations, his breath fogged the window as he whispered to his bunkmate, "Today marks 6 months since our capture at Falaise." The metallic scrape of tin cups against wooden tables drifted through the thin walls of Eden Camp for Klaus and nearly 1,200 other German prisoners of war. This was not the captivity they had been taught to expecting the Reich's training camps. Instructors had painted vivid pictures of what awaited captured German soldiers in enemy hands. British captivity, they warned, would mean starvation, torture, and slow death in freezing dungeons. The Geneva Convention, they claimed, it was nothing more than a scrap of paper that the British would discard the moment German boots crossed their prisoners' threshold. These men had marched into battle, believing that surrender meant the end of everything they held dear. That capture by the British would strip away not just their freedom, but their humanity itself. Yet Klaus found himself living in a world that defied every expectation drilled into his consciousness. Each morning, the camp bugler played reveille, not with the harsh commands he anticipated, but with the same dignified respect afforded to British soldiers. The guards who counted heads during roll call did so with professional efficiency, not the sadistic pleasure he had been conditioned to expect. Most jarring of all was the food. Real food, served on actual plates rather than the scraps thrown to animals that Nazi propaganda had promised would be his lot. The transformation had begun the moment Klaus first walked through Eden Camp's gates on August 15th, 1944. He had steeled himself for brutality, for the crushing of his spirit that SS instructors insisted was the British way. Instead, he encountered Sergeant Major Thompson, a weathered veteran of the Great War who spoke fluent German and explained the camp rules with matter-of-fact clarity. "You'll work on local farms," Thompson had said, his voice carrying authority without malice. "You'll be paid 1 shilling per day. You'll receive the same rations as British soldiers." Klaus had waited for the cruel laughter, for the revelation that this was merely psychological torture, designed to raise hopes before crushing them. The laughter never came. Historical records from the War Office reveal that Britain held over 550,000 German and Italian prisoners by war's end, housing them in more than 1,500 camps across the United Kingdom. Unlike the systematic starvation and abuse that characterized German treatment of Soviet prisoners, British policy adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention. Prisoners received 3,300 calories per day, more than many British civilians. During rationing, they worked 8-hour days with rest periods, received medical care equal to British soldiers, and were paid wages for their labor. Camp 174, officially designated as Eden Camp, exemplified this approach. Built initially by Italian prisoners in 1942, it housed German captives from mid-1944 until early 1949. The cognitive dissonance proved overwhelming for men like Klaus, who had spent years absorbing propaganda about British barbarism. Unteroffizier Heinrich Weber, captured at the same time as Klaus, later wrote in letters home, "I expected to die within weeks of capture. Instead, I find myself learning to speak English with farmers who treat me as they would their own sons." The letters, censored but not confiscated, revealed the prisoners' gradual realization that their captors operated under a fundamentally different moral framework than they had been taught to expect. This revelation extended beyond mere physical treatment to encompass something more profound: respect for human dignity. When Klaus developed pneumonia during the harsh winter of 1944-45, he was immediately transferred to the camp hospital. The British doctor, Captain Morrison, attended to Klaus with the same care he would show any patient. "You're a soldier like any other," Morrison told him in broken German. Politics end at my examining table, for Klaus, who had witnessed the deliberate medical neglect of Soviet prisoners in German camps. This simple act of professional duty represented a shattering of everything he thought he understood about his enemies. The work assignments further challenged preconceptions rather than being worked to death in coal mines or munitions factories. German prisoners found themselves assigned to agricultural labor that, while demanding, followed civilized patterns of work and rest. They harvested potatoes alongside land girls, their former enemies now working partners in Britain's desperate fight for food security. The irony was not lost on Klaus that German hands were helping to feed the very nation they had sought to starve through U-boat warfare. Most transformative was the gradual recognition that their British captors possessed something the German war machine had systematically destroyed. Institutional restraint guards at Eden Camp carried weapons but rarely displayed them threateningly. Punishments for minor infractions involved extra duties or temporary loss of privileges, not the brutal beatings that characterized German military discipline. When Jeffreiter Friedrich Holtz was caught returning late from farm work, having stopped to visit a local girl, his punishment was 2 weeks of kitchen duty. The severity of this punishment amused Klaus, who remembered comrades shot for far lesser offenses in Wehrmacht ranks. The camp's daily rhythm revolved around something uniquely British: the afternoon tea break at precisely 3:30 p.m. Work stopped across Eden Camp and the surrounding farms. Guards and prisoners alike gathered around makeshift tables for 15 minutes of tea and biscuits. This ritual, initially baffling to German prisoners accustomed to the relentless efficiency of their military system, gradually became a symbol of their captors' strained civilization. Here was a nation that would literally stop a war for tea. That built space into even the most urgent tasks for simple human comfort. Klaus began to understand that the tea break represented something more significant than mere habit. It embodied a worldview that valued individual dignity over mechanical efficiency, that recognized the importance of small pleasures, even in times of crisis. The British Guards shared their tea willingly, often using these brief interludes to practice English with their German charges or to share photographs from home. These moments of voluntary human connection, freely given rather than demanded by authority, represented a profound challenge to Nazi ideology. The camp library became another symbol of British civilization that confounded German expectations, stocked with books in German as well as English. It offered prisoners access to literature that had been banned in the Reich. Klaus discovered the works of Heinrich Heine, burned by Nazi students in 1933, and Thomas Mann, whose citizenship had been revoked. Reading these forbidden authors by electric light in a comfortable chair, with a British guard nearby reading his own book rather than standing threateningly over prisoners, Klaus began to grasp what his nation had sacrificed in its pursuit of power. Education programs at Eden Camp further demonstrated British values. Evening classes in English, mathematics, and trade skills were offered voluntarily to prisoners. The instructors, often local teachers who donated their time, treated German students with patience and respect. Klaus enrolled in an English literature course taught by Miss Margaret Thornton, a retired schoolmistress from nearby Malton. Her gentle correction of his pronunciation and thoughtful discussion of Shakespeare's themes of redemption and forgiveness provided a stark contrast to the browbeating pedagogy he remembered from Reich schools. The transformation was not uniform across all prisoners. Hardcore Nazi believers initially resisted the evidence of their senses, clinging to ideological explanations for British softness. They claimed the good treatment was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to weaken German resolve. Some organized resistance cells within the camp, attempting to maintain Nazi discipline and hierarchy. These efforts gradually collapsed as the reality of British fair treatment made extremist positions untenable. Klaus watched this ideological dissolution with fascination and horror. Obergefreiter Hans Kruger, once a fervent Nazi Party member, began questioning everything he had believed when British doctors saved his life during a burst appendix. If we are the master race, Kruger asked Klaus during one of their evening walks around the compound, why do they treat us better than we treated our own wounded? The question hung in the air like smoke from their shared cigarette. British tobacco that tasted somehow different from German. Milder and less harsh religious services provided another avenue for transformation. British military chaplains offered services for our Protestant and Catholic prisoners. With no attempt at conversion or ideological manipulation, Father O'Brien, an Irish Catholic priest, conducted masses in Latin that reminded Klaus of his childhood before the Nazi emphasis on Germanic. Paganism had contaminated even religious observance, the simple act of communal worship, freely chosen and respectfully facilitated by enemy guards, reintroduced concepts of transcendence and universal human dignity that Nazi ideology had worked to eliminate. The mail system revealed British administrative competence, and basic decency letters to and from Germany were censored for military information, but otherwise allowed to pass freely. British censors even provided translation assistance for prisoners struggling to express complex emotions in foreign languages. Klaus's correspondence with his sister Martha became a lifeline to humanity, a reminder that beyond the war lay a world of family affection and simple human concerns. The British not only permitted this correspondence but actively facilitated it, viewing connection to loved ones as a basic human right rather than a privilege to be withdrawn for punishment. As spring returned to Yorkshire in 1945, Klaus found himself working in the garden attached to a farmhouse owned by John and Mary Whittaker. The elderly couple had lost their son at Normandy, yet they treated Klaus with kindness that bordered on paternal care. Mary Whittaker insisted on providing lunch each day, serving it on her best china with genuine concern for Klaus's comfort. When he attempted to express his condolences for their son's death, John Whittaker clasped his shoulder and said simply, "War makes orphans of us all. Lad, no sense in carrying hatred longer than necessary." This gesture of forgiveness from people who had every reason to hate him completed Klaus's psychological transformation. He began to see the war not as a clash between superior and inferior races, but as a tragedy that had consumed the best of a generation on all sides. The British couple's ability to separate individual Germans from the Nazi system that had brought such suffering to their family demonstrated a moral sophistication that Klaus had been taught his enemies lacked. The news of Germany's surrender reached Eden Camp on May 8, 1945. Klaus expected celebration from the guards, perhaps triumphant speeches about British victory. Instead, Sergeant Major Thompson gathered the prisoners and spoke quietly about the work that lay ahead. "The war is over," he said, "but peace must be built. You men will be part of that building." There was no gloating, no vindictive satisfaction in enemy defeat. Instead, there was a kind of exhausted relief and an immediate focus on practical next steps, even after German surrender. British treatment of prisoners remained consistent with wartime standards. Men like Klaus were offered the opportunity to remain in Britain, to participate in the reconstruction they had helped to make necessary. This offer of permanent residence for former enemies demonstrated a confidence in British values and institutions that Klaus found both impressive and humbling. A nation secure in its principles could afford to welcome former enemies as future citizens. The symbolic power of simple objects became apparent as Klaus prepared to leave Eden Camp in February 1947. He had been offered repatriation to the British zone of occupied Germany or permanent residence in Yorkshire. His decision to remain in Britain was influenced by accumulated memories associated with small Things, the precise ticking of the camp's clock tower, which had regulated his days with mechanical reliability rather than arbitrary human whim. The weekly ration of chocolate distributed to prisoners with the same punctuality shown to British troops. The worn wooden handle of the spade he had used in the camp garden, smoothed by countless hands and representing honest labor fairly compensated. Most powerfully symbolic was his weekly tea ration. The same Ceylon blend provided to British guards and German prisoners alike, this simple equality of treatment, extending even to luxury items in wartime Britain, represented everything Klaus had discovered about his captors' character. They were a people who would share their tea with enemies, who maintained civilized standards even under pressure, who treated captured soldiers not as hated adversaries, but as fellow human beings temporarily on the wrong side of history. Camp's tea service became Klaus's most treasured possession, a chipped white cup and saucer that represented British civilization at its most essential in this modest ceramic vessel. He found embodied the values that had defeated Nazi ideology: respect for individual dignity, commitment to fair treatment regardless of nationality, and the quiet confidence that comes from living according to consistent moral principles. The cup accompanied Klaus to his new home in Malton, where he established a small engineering business and eventually married a local girl whose father had served as a guard at Eden Camp years later. When Klaus spoke to school children about his wartime experiences, he would always conclude by showing them his camp teacup. "This," he would say, "is what defeated Hitler, not just British bombs or American industry, but the idea that even enemies deserve to be treated with dignity. The Nazis taught us to hate, but the British showed us something more powerful. They showed us decency." The children would examine the modest cup with appropriate solemnity, understanding instinctively that they held in their hands an artifact of moral victory. The transformation Klaus experienced was replicated across Britain's network of prisoner-of-war camps. Official records indicate that approximately 25,000 German prisoners chose to remain in Britain after the war, becoming productive citizens of the nation. They had once fought against. Their integration into British society represented one of history's most successful examples of ideological rehabilitation through consistent adherence to civilized principles. This success had profound implications for post-war reconstruction in Europe. Former German prisoners who returned to their homeland carried with them direct experience of democratic governance and individual liberty. They became advocates for parliamentary democracy, trade union rights, and international cooperation. Many rose to positions of leadership in the Federal Republic of Germany, where their understanding of British values helped forge the Atlantic alliance that would define European security for the remainder of the century. The teacup that Klaus treasured represented more than personal transformation. It symbolized democracy's ultimate weapon against totalitarianism. Democratic societies defeat their enemies not merely through superior force, but through the attractive power of their principles. When democratic nations remain true to their values even in treating captured enemies, they demonstrate that their ideals possess genuine strength rather than mere convenience. Klaus's cup embodied this lesson. Democracy's greatest victory lies not in destroying its enemies, but in converting them through the simple expedient of treating them with justice. Eden Camp, now preserved as a museum, stands as testimony to the power of institutional decency. Visitors walking through the restored huts can see the chess sets carved by German prisoners, the theatrical costumes created for camp productions, the letters and photographs that recorded daily life under humane captivity. These artifacts tell a story not of British softness or German weakness, but of civilization's capacity to maintain its principles even under the stress of total war. The lesson extends beyond historical curiosity to contemporary relevance. In an age when democratic societies again face ideological challenges from authoritarian movements. The Eden Camp experience offers guidance. Democracies strengthen themselves not by abandoning their principles when confronted with extremist enemies, but by adhering to those principles so consistently that even enemies cannot deny their attractiveness. The treatment of prisoners becomes a test of national character, revealing whether a society's values are merely decorative or fundamentally integral to its identity. Klaus Richter died in 1987. Still living in Yorkshire, still treasuring his camp teacup, his funeral was attended by former prisoners and guards alike. Men who had discovered through wartime captivity that former enemies could become lasting friends. The eulogy, delivered by the son of Sergeant Major Thompson, concluded with words that captured the essence of Klaus's transformation. He came to us as an enemy and remained as a neighbor. That transformation represents the highest victory any nation can achieve. The cup now sits in the Eden Camp Museum, donated by Klaus's widow as a symbol of the human capacity for change. Visitors often pause before this humble vessel, recognizing in its simple lines the outline of a profound truth, that civilizations are measured not by their capacity for conquest, but by their ability to transform enemies into friends. The tea that once warmed Klaus during Yorkshire winters carried with it the taste of reconciliation, the flavor of a future where former adversaries could share the same table and drink from the same service. In the end, the German prisoners' expectations proved both wrong and irrelevant. They had expected brutality and found decency. They had anticipated hatred and discovered respect. They had prepared for degradation and encountered dignity. These discoveries changed not just individual lives but the trajectory of post-war European history. The men who left Eden Camp carried with them more than memories of fair treatment. They possessed living proof that democracy's principles were not mere propaganda but lived reality. Afternoon tea break that once puzzled Klaus became, in retrospect, the perfect metaphor for British civilization's approach to war and peace, even in the midst of humanity's greatest conflict. There remained time for courtesy, space for simple pleasures, respect for individual comfort. This was not weakness but strength, not naivety but wisdom, a civilization confident enough to stop for tea, even when fighting for its existence, possessed something that military might alone could never defeat. The quiet assurance that comes from knowing one's cause is just and one's methods honorable. That knowledge, brewed strong as Yorkshire tea and served with the same generosity to friend and enemy alike, proved to be democracy's secret weapon. Klaus Richter learned its power one cup at a time, and in learning it, he discovered the difference between conquest and conversion, between victory and peace. His story, multiplied across thousands of similar transformations, explains how Britain won not just a war, but the peace that followed. One prisoner, one cup of tea, one act of basic human decency at a time. The legacy endures in the simple recognition that how a nation treats its enemies reveals its true character. Eden Camp stands as monument to that principle. Its preserved huts and restored facilities, proclaiming to future generations that civilized societies need never abandon their values, no matter how desperate the circumstances. In maintaining those values, they discover their greatest strength, the power to transform hatred into understanding, enemies into friends, and war into the foundation for lasting peace.